Next, I'm going to create some variables to use with my colors. As you can see, throughout my file, I'm using the same color values multiple times and in multiple locations. I can definitely consolidate this down and make it easier to manage by using variables. I'll create several variables, and the names of my variables, you'll notice, are going to be primary color, secondary color, neutral color. I'm not specifying that this is blue, or that this is gray, or this is a light beige. The reason why is because these colors might change. Instead of naming the variable with a description of what it is, it's better to name it with a description of what it does. You'll get more mileage this way, especially if you're going to change these things at some later point. If my primary color changes from blue to green, but the name of the variable was called blue, then it's not going to make very much sense when you look through the code and I have these variables that say blue even though the color is rendering out to being green. Now that I have this, I'm going to go through my file and I'm going to find everywhere that I'm using this blue color, and I'm going to replace it with my primary color variable name. You'll also notice that when I declared my variables, I have some variables that are using RGB values and one of them that's using an hex value. You can also use keywords here as well. So every time I see the blue color, and sometimes I used hex values and sometimes I used RGBs, I'm going to replace this with the name of my variable. So we'll just go ahead and add our primary color variable name to all of these declarations. And as you can see, I'm doing this in quite a few places throughout my code. Now here on my H1, I'm actually using that same blue, but I'm using it at a 60% alpha. So here I'm using RGBA. Remember that our variable was defined as simply RGB. I'm not using the alpha. That's okay. We can still incorporate that with our variables. So instead of having the actual RGB values displaying inside of the parentheses, I'm simply going to say primary color, and then I'll put a comma, and then I'll pass on the opacity or the alpha. I'm doing the same thing for the border bottom. So again, I'm just going to replace this with the name of my variable, and then we'll pass on the opacity. And finally, we're going to replace all of the background colors on the boxes with our variable. If I save my page and we go look, nothing on the page should change at all. And that's because we haven't actually changed any of the colors. All we're doing is we're making use of the variables. But you can see that I actually replaced the color value in many locations, probably in about 10 or 12 places within my CSS. So at some point in time, if my boss or whoever comes along and says, you know what, we don't really want to use this blue anymore, we want the blue to be a green color. Well, if I wasn't using variables, I would have to comb through my code and I would have to find everywhere that I was using that particular color of blue and then replace it with a new RGB or a new hex value. Look how easy it is to make this change using variables. I'm simply going to alter the RGB values here, so I'll plug in some other numbers and we'll just make this a green color. So now the color is going to be this shade of green. If we save this and we go look at it in the browser, you're now going to see that everything is now updated with this new green shade. Obviously, this is extremely flexible because I can quickly make changes to my page and only have to affect one line of code. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to set my gray shade to my secondary color. So right here, I'm using this shade of gray. I'm going to replace this with my variable name of secondary color. And I'll just comb through my code and find anywhere that I'm using a shade of gray. I think that's the only place. And then I'm going to use my variable called neutral color, which I'm using in quite a few locations. So I'm going to come through and find anywhere that I'm using this hex value. And if you know that you're using hex values, you could obviously use a find and replace to specify these new variable names. It's going to be easiest for you just to use your variable names from the get-go. So thinking and planning ahead and coming up with the variables is going to save you some time. And I just saw another place I'm using a neutral gray, so I'm just going to replace this with my secondary color variable name. All right, if we save the page and we refresh, Again, nothing has really changed here because all I'm doing is I'm simply using my variable names. However, if I decide that I want to restructure the page, I now have a very efficient way to do so. All I have to do is replace the variable values. In addition to setting these colors, I'm also going to set up some variables for sizing. And as you can see, I'm passing on some values here. These tend to all be pixels, so I have a small space, medium space, large space, and a box size. And now I'm simply going to go through and I'm going to change some of my declarations that I'm using, and they might not be exactly the same, but we're just going to take advantage of using our variables. I'll change some of the declarations and specify the values as being variables. So right down here on our box, you can see that I'm specifying a width and a height and a padding. We're going to replace these values with our new variable. So I made a variable called box size. I'm going to use that for both the width and the height. And then my padding here is using 10 pixels. Well, I have a variable called medium space, which I'm going to plug in for this value as well. And you can go ahead and specify these things anywhere you want. Like on my H1, instead of using 5ems, I might decide I just want to use my medium space. So I can plug in the variable name there. I'm going to change the padding on my search here to use small space and then large space. My layout is going to change a little bit because the numbers are not exact match. But we'll go ahead and save. And now if we refresh, there's some slight adjustments. It looks like I need to adjust my go button as well because it's slightly bigger than the search box. So let's go back and make that change as well. That's happening right here on the button. It's a little bit bigger, but I actually don't mind that, so I'm just going to leave that as is. The last thing that I'm going to do right now is I'm going to make a new variable called base font size. I'll set that to 15 pixels, and I'm going to also set a default line height. And that'll just be set to 1.4. Now I'm going to come down here to where I have made a declaration for my paragraph tag. Instead of specifying the size as being 0.875 ems /1.4, I'm going to plug in my variable values. If we save this and we go refresh, you're going to see that the font size has gotten very small, and it actually looks smaller than our 15 pixels. I'm going to inspect so I can show you what's going on. And if we look here, you can see that the font size is actually rendering out at 10.7. So what's happening here? Why is the font size rendering out at 10.7? And here's the declaration for line height. It's set to normal, which is the default value. It's not rendering out at 1.4. So what's happening right here? Well, in SASS, you actually have the ability to perform mathematical calculations. So when it sees this / in conjunction with the variables, what's happening is it's dividing the base font size by the line height. So we actually, in order to use this, we can't use standard shorthand notation with variable names. We would have to change this. So I'm simply going to pull out my line height. I'll leave the shorthand notation that uses base font size and body text, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in a new rule for line height. And because I'm using nesting on my font weight and my font style, I'll leave those as is, and we'll go ahead and add our line height. Now when I save, if we go back and refresh the page, you can see how the paragraph styling is rendering more as we would expect. And if we look in the inspector, we now are getting 15 pixels for our font size, and our line height is 1.4. So do keep that in mind. That is a caveat to using variables, and we'll talk more about why we would want to use the mathematical operations, but that's going to come in some later sections of our course. I did want to show you this though, in case you encountered it, and so that you are aware of what potentially could happen. Well, now you know how to use basic variables, and you can see how powerful they are. Obviously, if I want to make any change to my color scheme or my spacing or my sizing, all I have to do is come up here and change the values of the variables, and every single place that they're being used within my SASS file are going to now update. This is really handy and very powerful.